Colorado, 1993, Ranger Frederick Bailey disappears in the San Juan National Forest. His car is found a week later with a broken headlight and strange prints on the hood. The case is closed as an accident, but nobody's found. 30 years pass. The year is 2023. School children on a field trip discover a human skull in the hollow of an old tree. An examination confirms that it is Bailey's remains. How did the skull get there? What happened to the ranger in August 1993? This story, which has kept us in suspense for 3 decades, is still full of unanswered questions. August 1993 was hot and dry in Colorado. Frederick Bailey, a 41-year-old ranger in the San Juan National Forest, was a responsible and experienced man. During his years of service, he had encountered wild animals, bad weather, and lawbreakers on numerous occasions. But this time, it all started as a routine assignment. The Forest Service had received complaints from tourists and local residents about strange nighttime cries coming from a remote area of the forest, not far from an old abandoned logging road. People reported broken trees, unnaturally large footprints on the ground, and sounds unlike the howling of a coyote or the growling of a bear. Bailey was ordered to check out the area. That evening, he radioed in to say he had reached the location and found nothing unusual. That was his last communication. The next morning, Frederick failed to report in, and a search was launched immediately. Fellow rangers, police, and volunteers joined the operation. They combed the forest for several days, but to no avail. A week later, the search party found Bailey's service jeep on a narrow forest road, about 15 kilometers from where he had last made contact. The scene was strange and disturbing. The front headlight of the jeep was smashed, and shards of glass lay on the ground. There were clear handprints on the hood, but they were not human handprints. They were much larger, with long, thin fingers. The size of the prints baffled even experienced trackers. Next to the car lay a broken carbine that belonged to Bailey. The weapon was damaged, as if it had been struck with force against something hard. However, no traces of blood were found on the weapon or around the car. Despite the evidence found, the official version was that it was a bear attack. They said that a large grizzly bear attacked the ranger, damaged the car and the weapon, and dragged the body deep into the forest. This version seemed extremely unconvincing. First, the tracks around the vehicle did not match those of a bear. Second, bears rarely attack people without provocation, and usually leave clear signs of a struggle and blood behind. Third, the ranger's body was never found, despite a thorough search. Local residents and Bailey's colleagues refused to believe this version, but the case was quickly closed. 30 years passed. The story of Frederick Bailey was gradually forgotten, becoming overgrown with rumors and speculation. Then in June 2023, during a school trip to the San Juan forest, a group of teenagers stumbled upon an old, fallen tree with a large hollow. One of the students looked inside and discovered something that horrified everyone: a human skull. The police and forensic experts were immediately called to the scene. A preliminary examination of the skull showed that it was in relatively good condition, considering the time that had passed. However, one detail stood out. The skull had been literally shoved into the hollow with tremendous force. This was evidenced by cracks and chips on the bones, as well as the position of the skull inside the tree. Forensic experts immediately took DNA samples for analysis. The results came back quickly and were shocking. The skull belonged to Frederick Bailey, a ranger who had gone missing 30 years earlier. But where were the rest of the bones? Why was only the skull found, and in such a strange way? These questions reopened the old, unsolved case. The return of the Frederick Bailey case from the cold case files was a real bombshell for La Plata County. The discovery of the skull 30 years later not only confirmed the ranger's death, but it also completely destroyed the official version of the bear attack. The forensic experts who conducted the re-examination were categorical. No bear was capable of such a feat. The nature of the damage to the skull indicated that it had been pushed into a narrow hole in the tree with tremendous focused force. It was a deliberate act, not the result of a random coincidence or the actions of an animal trying to hide its prey. The news prompted those who had remained silent for decades to speak up. One of those people was Mark Coulson, a former sheriff's deputy who was one of the first on the scene when Bailey's Jeep was found in 1993. Now in his 60s and retired, he remembers the events of that August in minute detail. In a recent interview with a local TV station, he shared memories that were not included in the official reports. Coulson said that the atmosphere at the scene was depressing. Everyone understood that the bear theory was an attempt to quickly close the case and calm the public. None of the experienced searchers and hunters believed it. According to Coulson, the most disturbing element was the palm prints on the hood of the SUV. They were taken and photographed, but the report described them very vaguely. Coulson remembers them clearly. These were not just large palms. They had a strange, elongated shape. The fingers were disproportionately long and thin, with almost no joints, and the palm itself was narrow. The thumb was positioned lower than in humans, indicating a completely different grip mechanism. He had never seen anything like it before or since. Coulson also mentioned that deep vertical scratches had been found on the driver's door of the SUV below the handle. There were 5 of them. They did not resemble bear claw marks, which usually leave parallel grooves. These scratches were thin and deep, as if they had been made with something sharp, like sharpened bone tips. Another detail that was omitted from the official report concerned Bailey's carbine. The documents state that it was broken. Coulson clarifies, the rifle was not broken by impact. It was bent. The barrel and stock were tilted at an unnatural angle, as if the weapon had been taken by both ends and bent over a knee. To do this to steel and wood requires not just great strength, but monstrous force focused at a single point. No fall or blow against a tree could have caused such damage. It was done deliberately. But the most important thing that made the police re-examine the case was the initial complaints that had sent Bailey to the area in the first place. Journalists dug up the archives and found several documented calls to 911 in the Forest Service office in the week before the ranger's disappearance. The calls were mainly from tourists camping at Emerald Lake and one local farmer whose property bordered the forest. They all described the same thing, piercing, drawn-out screams coming from the forest at night. One of the tourists, a former military man, described the sound as a mixture of a woman's scream and the squeal of a wounded animal, amplified several times over. The sound was so loud and disturbing that it caused the windows of a farmhouse a mile away from the edge of the forest to rattle. In addition to the sounds, there were other oddities. The farmer complained about broken treetops along his fence. The trees, mostly young pines and aspens, had not been cut down or blown over by the wind. Their trunks, 3 to 4 meters high, were twisted and broken, as if some giant creature had simply walked by and snapped them off. No traces of machinery or people were found nearby. Tourists reported large, blurry footprints in the damp ground near the stream. The footprints were bipedal, but the size of the feet was almost twice that of a human. Frederick Bailey, as the ranger in charge, went to check out these reports. He was skeptical and assumed that he was dealing with either poachers or some animal unknown to the local fauna, possibly from another region. He was not prepared for what awaited him. The last radio contact with him was around 8 p.m. He told the dispatcher that he had reached an old logging road and was going to walk to the creek where the tracks had been spotted. He sounded calm, with no alarm in his voice. He promised to check in an hour. No one heard from him again. When the search party found his Jeep, the engine was cold and there was a half-eaten sandwich and an open thermos with cold coffee in the passenger compartment. Everything indicated that he had left the car suddenly, possibly hearing or seeing something that made him drop everything and go to investigate. Something that ended up bending his rifle, leaving strange marks on the hood, and ending his life in such a way that 30 years later, only his skull was found, wedged into a tree hollow. The new information made investigators wonder, were they even looking for the right thing in 1993? And could the creature that screamed and broke trees still be living in the forests of San Juan? In 2023, armed with new information and modern forensic techniques, investigators attempted to reconstruct the last hours of Frederick Bailey's life. The picture that emerged was devoid of any mysticism, but full of primal horror. Leaving his Jeep, Bailey most likely headed on foot toward the stream, where, according to his assumptions, the strange sounds were coming from. He was armed, confident, and acting according to instructions. The forest in this area became increasingly dense, forming impassable windbreaks. The distance from the road to the stream was no more than 800 meters, but it was a challenging route. Landscape analysis experts suggest that Bailey reached a small clearing surrounded by tall old fir trees. This is where the source of the noise was. Perhaps it was the dining room or lair of an unknown creature. Judging by the broken trees reported by eyewitnesses, it was not only strong, but also tall, capable of reaching branches 3 to 4 meters high. The ranger probably saw it before it noticed him. An experienced tracker, he crept. What he saw must have shaken him to the core, prompting him to raise his rifle immediately. The events that followed unfolded rapidly. Weapons experts, after studying photographs of the bent rifle, concluded that such damage would have required a short, powerful lever. This rules out a prolonged struggle. The most likely scenario is that the creature, sensing danger, attacked with incredible speed. It did not attack Bailey, but first neutralized his weapon. A long, strong limb could have grabbed or struck the rifle, bending it in one motion. This indicates not just strength, but tactical behavior aimed at disarming the enemy. After that, Frederick Bailey was left alone with a creature that surpassed him in height, strength, and possibly speed. No traces of blood were found at the site where the Jeep and carbine were discovered, because the main attack most likely took place here, in the clearing by the stream. The ranger's fate was sealed in a matter of seconds. What happened next explains both the absence of the body and the gruesome discovery 30 years later. The creature did not leave its victim behind. It carried the body away, deep into the forest, into its territory, where no search party could reach it. Animals often drag their prey to a secluded place. Still, the subsequent actions go beyond the behavior of a typical predator. Why was only the skull left, and why was it found in a tree hollow? Criminologists and zoologists called in as consultants put forward a single but frightening hypothesis. It was not food storage. It was a territorial marker, just as wolves or bears mark their territory with scent or scratches on trees. This creature used a more visible and intimidating method. It literally hammered its prey's skull into the tree to mark the boundaries of its domain. It was a signal intended either for its own kind or for other predators. A signal that said, "This is my land, do not trespass." The force with which the skull was placed in the hollow was a demonstration of dominance. After the case was reopened in 2023, county authorities were faced with an unprecedented problem. They had proof of murder, they had identified the victim, but they had no suspect that could be described within the framework of known science. The investigation once again reached a dead end. No new expeditions into the depths of that section of the forest were organized. Instead, under the pretext of preserving a unique ecosystem and protecting rare plant species, the U.S. Forest Service closed off access to Emerald Lake and the surrounding area for an indefinite period. All trails were blocked and signs prohibiting entry were posted on the roads. Officially, the case of Frederick Bailey remains unsolved. The cause of death was determined to be violent, as a result of an attack by an unidentified person or animal. There is no mention of a creature that does not fit into the classification of North American fauna in official documents. This is a silent admission that the authorities have encountered something they cannot explain or control. Ranger Bailey's story is over, but the story of the creature that inhabits the forests of San Juan probably continues, and the skull, which lay for 30 years in a dark hollow, serves as a silent testimony that even in the 21st century, there are places on the map of the world where man is not the master, but only a casual, defenseless guest. And sometimes these places send cruel and unambiguous warnings to those who violate their borders.